But now that's out of Denver working for the school research department.
So we hope.
Block the camera. Are we blocking the camera?
It's okay, don't worry about it. We'll fix it. I'm just worried. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the annual Anastasi Lecture. I am aware that this audience needs no introduction to Anastasi's pioneering research in psychometrics, which earned her the unforgettable moniker of test guru. Her work focused on test construction, test misuse, test interpretation and misinterpretation, and cultural bias. She argued against the strictly hereditary argument on trait formation and emphasized the role of experiential, environmental, and cultural influences on test scores. She had more than 150 publications, including the very influential textbook called Psychological Testing. And all of that you can get from any first encyclopedia entry on Anastasi. You all know the highlights. But what I'd like to bring to your attention today is some lesser known facts about her that I think cast a very interesting light on her and her work, and also her importance here at Fordham to us as someone whose work and whose persona influenced the department and psychology at Fordham as such. It is interesting in this context to look at some vignettes of Anastasi's earlier formation, where she came from. And what's interesting is that she came from the Bronx. So obviously today we're not in the Bronx, but the beginnings of the psychology department certainly were. She was schooled at home by her grandmother and a tutor until age 9. Her father died very early when she was only 1 year old, and her mother, who clearly was a very resourceful person, had to support the family. This early training instilled in Anastasi a boundless intellectual curiosity and possibly gave her a happy unawareness of gender stereotypes when it came to schooling at that time. When she entered public school at age 9, she was moved several grades ahead right out of the gate. But her high school experience was, by contrast, very disappointing, according to many who remember her from that time. And she dropped out after only 2 months. She was a school dropout. She soon learned, however, that Barnard College did not require a high school diploma, so for a dropout, that was an interesting turn of events. And she spent 2 years preparing for the entrance exams and then gained admission to college at the ripe age of 15. She was hoping to major in mathematics, but lectures with Harry Hollingworth sparked her interest in psychology. After graduating from Barnard in 1928 with a BA in psychology, Anastasi entered Columbia to study for her Ph.D. The formative experience of those years was probably her research assistantship with Charles B. Davenport, who was working on what were then called culture-free tests. She also had the opportunity to attend the International Congress of Psychology at Yale, where she met Charles Sperman and the Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov. She was truly a precocious doctoral candidate and earned her PhD at the age of 21. So the age that most of our undergraduates are when they graduate with a bachelor's degree. But if her scientific career was in full swing, her health was not quite. In 1933, she was diagnosed with cervical cancer, and the treatment left her unable to have children. And the only reason why I bring this to your attention is that what resulted from it was a kind of disturbing comment on the position of women in academia in the 1930s, because Anastasi apparently credited her professional success to her inability to have children, remarking that the inability to have children, quote, freed her from conflicts around motherhood. So clearly assuming that those conflicts would have been preeminent for a woman scientist at that time. Not that they've gone away. After graduating with a Ph.D., Anastasi held teaching positions at Barnard and at Queen's College, where she served as department chair, a position with which I think some of us can truly empathize. She came to Fordham as an associate professor of psychology in 1947, was promoted to professor in 1951, and remained here until her retirement in 1979. So a good long career at Fordham. In 1972, Anastasi was recognized for her scientific achievement and elected president of the American Psychological Association as only the third woman in the organization's history to hold that position. In 1987, President Ronald Reagan presented her with a National Medal of Science, the highest award for scientific achievement in the US. Other recipients of this prestigious award included such luminaries as B.F. Skinner, for example. She was in good company. She was named the most prominent living woman in psychology in the English-speaking world, but was said to have been uncomfortable with that designation, insisting that she was simply a psychologist, not a woman psychologist. As usual, the full picture of a person does not emerge without an anecdote or two. And we actually have an anecdote to quote that was published in the New York Times and contributed to by one of your departmental colleagues, Dr. Mary Prosidano. And so apparently amongst her colleagues, Anastasi was known for, quote, a certain indifference to the more practical aspects of daily life. And I apologize if some of you already heard this. So I will quote this anecdote in full as it was written up in the New York Times on the occasion of Anastasi's death. So once Dr. Mary Prosidano said she heard a shriek coming from Dr. Anastasi's office. Running to see what was wrong, she found Dr. Anastasi trying to pry the plug out of an electrical outlet by using a metal letter opener. Did you get a shock? Dr. Prosidano asked. How fascinating, Dr. Anastasi replied, letter opener in hand. How did you know it was a shock? Dr. Anastasi retired from Fordham in 1979, at which time Fordham also conferred on her an honorary Doctor of Science degree. She died in 2001. So Professor David Budescu, to my left here, is the first holder of the Anastasi Professorship of Quantitative Psychology and Psychometrics at Fordham. The prestigious chair was inaugurated in 2008 with a bequest created in the name of Anastasi to enhance her legacy at Fordham and in the world. Fordham's president, Father Joseph M. McShane of the Society of Jesus, said on the day of the inauguration that Anastasi was a force of nature, whose achievements have put Fordham's psychology department on the map. Professor Budescu is no less a force of nature, I can tell you, and we are deeply grateful to him for keeping Anastasi's spirit alive and well at Fordham. His inaugural lecture in 2008 was the first in the series to which today's occasion belongs. The Anastasi Lecture showcased emerging research directions in psychometrics and measurement, as well as critical policy applications of these findings. And now I give you Professor Budescu, the Anastasi Professor of Quantitative Psychology and Psychometrics, to introduce today's distinguished speaker, Dr. Fritz Drasgow, Dean of the School of the Labor of Employment Relations at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you for the kind words. And I want to start by thanking again the School of the Graduate Schools of Arts and Science and the department for supporting these lectures for the 10th year. and for all the help in putting this all together. Last year, after the lecture, someone asked me, where can I get a list of Anastasi's publications? And I looked around, turns out that no one in the department or the university had an actual CG list of publications. So one of the projects over this summer, two of our grad students, Roxanne and Caitlin, did a lot of search on all the databases and were able to put together an, I think, almost complete and almost authoritative list of all our publications, about 167. And now you can go to our website and you can find it. And soon there will probably be also a searchable database. So this brings me to the pleasure of introducing our guest speaker, Fritz Drasgow, who is professor of psychology and the dean of the College of Labor and Industrial Relationships at the University of Illinois. In fact, I think that you can call Fritz mystery liner. Fritz got his master and his Ph.D. in quantitative psychology at Illinois. He spent 3 years at Yale and then came back in 1982, 83, and he never left. And it's in your honor, I actually managed to find an orange and blue Illinois tie. And so he's been there in the Department of Psychology and now also in the School of Industrial Relationship ever since. Research is in measurement, in all areas of measurement, and over his career, he has made contribution in practically every single aspect of this area. IRT, unidimensionality, test appropriateness, adaptive testing, and modeling. Furthermore, his work on things that cover multiple areas, achievement, testing in organizational psychology. According to the Society of Industrial and Organizational Psychology, who was president of, he is one of the top 20 most prolific researchers in industrial, in organizational IO psychology. He has published over 200 papers and 5 or 6 books. And he has not only been a very, very influential and prolific researcher, but he has also contributed a lot of his knowledge to real-life issues. He's been on many committees and many task forces that have to do with testing. I'll read just a few. Chairperson of the American Psychological Association Committee on Psychological Testing and Test and Assessment. Department of Defense Advisory Committee on Military Personnel Testing. APA Task Force on Internet Testing. One more. Member of the committee to revise the standard of educational psychological testing, and then he's been an advisory board for the College Board, GRE, and many other committees. So if Anastasi was testing guru, I think that Fritz is a wonderful follower, and we're looking forward to this talk today about personality testing.
Thank you, David, for those kind words. I appreciate it. And indeed, I really enjoyed your comments in Anastasi. I have known about her work for many years, but I didn't know about the person. So that was very interesting. Today I want to talk about moving measurement forward. There have been thousands, if not tens of thousands, of psychometrician years devoted to psychometric theory and practice for cognitive tests. The number of professional psychometrician years devoted to measurement of self-report instruments is just tiny. The self-report instruments, personality, vocational interests, values, attitudes, have largely been by non-psychometricians. And I'm going to argue that it shows. So it's time to move beyond liquor. Before I begin, I want to thank my colleagues. I've done this work with a number of people through the years. Special thanks to Sasha Chernyshenko, Steve Stark, and Chris Nye, 3 of my former doctoral students, who are all now faculty members around the world. Len White and Tonya Hefner for the Army Research Institute, Chris Zubiak and Kristen Morgan from PDRI. Deborah Knapp and our friends at Humro have all been instrumental in this work. So what I'm going to talk about is really, it's not my work, it's the work of a large number of people that have directly pushed things forward. So here's the outline of what I want to talk about. I'm going to give some history, setting the stage for where we are today, which I'll summarize as doom and gloom. And then I'll talk about the way forward, how we can move things using an ideal point measurement model to alternative force choice format with the multi-dimensional pairwise preference model. And as an example, I'll talk about TAPAS, the Tailored Adaptive Personality Assessment System, and then show you some evidence that it actually works. So, okay, 1932, one of the most famous, everybody here knows Likert scales, right? Likert scales, everybody uses Likert scales. It comes from a 1932 paper, which was really written in response to the work by Louis Thurstone, which I'll get to in a minute. And he proposed a simpler approach than Thurstone scaling, just a 5-point response scale, the strongly approve, strongly agree to strongly disapprove or strongly disagree, and numerical values for the response scales, and then your total score was just the sum or the mean of the numerical scores. So Likert evaluated his evaluation for his scale was by split half reliability and item total correlations. And to make his approach work, he hit upon the idea of reverse scoring, which I think probably everybody now knows about reverse scoring. But if you have some of your items written in one direction, like I believe our country needs a strong military, and our military should always be ready to fight for our country, so strong militaristic perspective, then a pacifistic item like war should be avoided at all costs needs to be reverse scored, so that a high score means the same thing on every item. So with the reverse scoring, so the negative items are flipped around, Likert then computed item total correlations and came to the conclusion that if a 0 or very low correlation coefficient is obtained, it indicates that the statement fails to measure that which the rest of the statements measure. So that's the criterion for throwing something out. Thus, item analysis reveals the satisfactoriness of any statement so far as its inclusion in the given attitude scale is concerned. And so the implication of this is that intermediate statements like compulsory military training in all countries should be reduced but not eliminated. That intermediate items have near zero item total correlations. Likert's conclusion was that they're double barrel. Like, so everybody heard the double barrel items are ambiguous because you don't know whether somebody's agreeing with the one part or the other part, and so they correlate near zero with the total score. And so if the quote from his paper is double barreled and of little value because it does not differentiate persons in terms of their attitudes. So that's Likert scaling, and it's what Clyde Coons called a dominance response process, which is the higher you are in the trait, the more likely you are to endorse an item or answer an item correctly in a cognitive ability test. So all of that was in contrast to Louis Thurstone, who in the late 1920s published a series of papers that assumed a conscious person would endorse a statement that reflected his or her attitude, but, quote, as a result of imperfections, obscurities, or irrelevancies in the statement and inaccuracies or carelessness of the subjects, not everybody will endorse a statement, even when it matches their attitude. So to put it a little more formally, if N sub 1 people have attitude S sub 1, all should endorse a statement whose scale value is S sub 1. So when the scale value is right on, equal to the person's trait value, they should all endorse the item if they were conscientious and if the item was perfect. But in reality, people are not all completely conscientious, items are not perfect, so only N sub 1 are going to actually endorse the small N sub 1 will endorse the item. And so here's a picture from one of his 1929 papers where you can see at attitude value S sub 1 that people were perfectly conscientious, all N sub 1 would endorse item, but only small N sub 1 actually do. And for statements that are at S sub 2 or S sub 3, a lower proportion of people will endorse those items as the distance of the statement from S sub 1 gets larger, the probability of endorsement goes down. So this is from Thurstone's 28 paper, militarism and pacifism with 6 statements representing a range of attitudes from extreme pacifism to neutral to extreme militarism. So according to Thurstone, a pacifist would be willing to endorse all or most of the options in the range of D to E. So in this range, a pacifist would endorse those. Pacifists might not endorse F because it's too extreme, and would not endorse these is because they're too militaristic. So, and then Thurstone's conclusion is a person's attitude would be indicated by the average or mean of the items that were endorsed. It's different than Likert, whose total score is what Likert's total score is the sum of the item scores. So in this militarism scale, 3 people could all endorse 2 items. So person 1 could endorse F and D and be very, very pacifistic. Another person could endorse E and B and be neutral. And a third person could endorse C and A and be very militaristic. So according to Thurstone, your sum score is not a good measure of the attitude. You have to look at the scale values of the items that you endorse. So, so this is what Coombs called an ideal point model, and sometimes it's called an unfolding model. And the key point with an unfolding model is that you tend to endorse items that are close to your attitude. So Likert implies a dominance model, putting this in a more modern framework. This is a 3-parameter logistic item response theory curve. Shows that the higher a person's trait value, the higher the theta, the more likely positive response is. Or in achievement testing, the more likely a correct response is. And so if the item's extremity is down here and a person's trait value is up here, they're going to answer it positively with almost certainty. So there's the person up here. So, and the ideal point process is different. That an item like I enjoy chatting quietly with a friend at a cafe, a person can disagree with that statement because they're too introverted, and we'll call that disagreeing from below. Or a person can disagree because, and that's disagreeing from above. So here you can see that this item, chatting quietly at a cafe, is an intermediate item, and the introvert disagrees from below, and the intense extrovert disagrees from above. And it would only be people in the middle who are going to tend to agree with it. So that's the review of some history. Now let me talk about doom and gloom. Analyzing intermediate ideal point items with the dominance model is going to give you item total correlations near 0, factor loadings near 0, item response theory and discrimination parameters near 0. They're going to seem to be bad items. And it turns out, and I'll show you in a minute, I enjoy chatting quietly with a friend at a cafe. It's actually a good item. It's an intermediate item. It's got a near 0 item total correlation. And are double-barreled items really bad items? Or have we been misled since 1932? So for example, although I try to keep everything in its place, it does not always work for me. That's double-barreled. And it's has a near 0 item total correlation, but it's a good item. It's when you analyze it with an appropriate model, it's got a reasonably good discrimination parameter. Some other concerns about Likert scales is response styles. So extreme response style, some people tend to use 1 and 5 more than the midpoint. Midpoint response style, some people tend to use the middle of the scale. This is a real concern in cross-cultural research. People from Eastern cultures tend to have a midpoint response style. People from the United States tend to have the extreme response style. And so we're using different, the items have differential item functioning. And so how do you compare scores to see are Chinese more conscientious or introverted than Americans when the items are not measured in the same way in the different cultures? And this response style differences is just an unsolvable problem, I think, that out in the real world, do annual performance ratings. And so that you can be rated on a 1 through 5 scale or a 1 through 9 scale or this scale or that scale. And industrial organizational psychologists devoted probably 30 years of research to try to come up with a response scale that reduces response styles. And for example, the behaviorally anchored rating scale. So you have your 1 through 7 scale, and then you have specific behaviors pointing at different places in the scale, so that we all know really what a 3 means, because here's the behavior that's a 3. It turns out that doesn't work worth a darn. It doesn't work really any better than just 1 through 5 with no labels. And ultimately, this led to Frank Landy and Jim Farr calling for an end to research on tweaking rating scales to make them more resistant to rating scale errors, because the line of research was just an utter failure. Okay, here's another problem with Likert scale items from the employment context. If you're going to take a pre-employment assessment, so you want to get a job, you have to take this personality assessment. To what extent do you agree with the following statements? I get along well with my coworkers. What's the answer? I always get my work done in time. I insult people. My friends say I'm absent-minded. Like, they're so totally transparent, aren't they? So these are called single stimulus items. In high-stakes settings, faking good or socially desirable responding can be a serious concern. There is some controversy in the organizational literature about whether people actually fake good or not. There's some people whose research says people don't fake good. All of the data sets I've ever seen from really high-stakes settings with these single statements, the scores are extremely elevated compared to answering the same statements for research purposes or for self-development or self-improvement. So Len White and his colleagues from the Army Research Institute said, high levels of socially desirable responding severely attenuated the predictability of personality constructs across multiple criteria in their research. So here's the doom and gloom summary. Traditional dominance models for self-report data meets a model misspecification. And where this is really a problem, if you want to do differential item functioning, if you want to do computer adaptive testing, if you want to do these more sophisticated applications, you need to have the right measurement model, or else your results probably are not going to be worth anything. Differences in cultural differences in response styles to Likert scaling items lead to scores that are incommensurate across people and across cultures. And faking good it's just way too easy for single statements. So I guess I have to admit, maybe I'm overstating my case a little bit, that if you're doing a study with Psych 100 subjects, you randomly assign people to conditions, you can compare the means across the different, and then you use a Likert scale to measure something. You can compare across the conditions because you've randomly assigned people to conditions and you've controlled for difference, that controls for differences in response styles. If you want to compare students in Beijing in their conscientiousness to students in the United States in conscientiousness, as a new study by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, is planning to do, an international study of 10 to 12 cities and nations around the world and compare social and emotional skills across cultures, I think you're in trouble if you try to use a Likert scale. So what can we do to move forward? So my argument is going to be use an ideal point model for the psychometric model, and then get rid of Likert scale items. So let's talk about an ideal point model. The one that we've used in our research is the generalized graded unfolding model, developed by Jim Roberts and his colleagues. And it assumes the probability of endorsement is higher the closer the item and the person are, the item's extremity and the person's trait value. As it gets closer, our probability of a positive response is higher. And then GGUM 2004 software provides estimates of item parameters. And so here are two response functions that we've estimated from actual data. The one on the left is I enjoy chatting quietly with a friend at a cafe. And this is what I argued before is a good item. It's not perfect in the Thurstone sense. The top of the curve doesn't go all the way up to 1, but you can definitely see that people with intermediate trait values are much more likely to endorse the item. Another item I am about as organized as most people. Has the same pattern. So in a series of studies that we've conducted over the last 15 years, dominance models like the two-parameter logistic and factor analysis only fit personality data if you carefully pre-select the items to eliminate the intermediate items. If you include intermediate items and then compute a valid measure of fit, you'll find a really substantial misfit. Ideal point models fit items that are low, intermediate, and high in their trait values. So that's the ideal point model, and then the alternative format that we've been using to get around the Likert format is a two alternative forced choice. There are other people that are looking at 3 alternative and 4 alternative forced choice. But the idea here is you have, in our work, we have pairs of statements, or you have triples or quadruples of statements, and you need to pick, for pairs of statements, you'd say, which of these 2 statements is most like you? And so now if you're applying for a job, you really want to get, which of these 2 items are you going to choose? So you admit this is harder, right, to pick the statement that's going to make you look good, because we match these 2 statements in social desirability. Some people have been working with triples of items, where you pick the statement that's most like you and least like you. When you have a pair of statements, midpoint and extreme response styles don't seem relevant, do they? Because you're not making a numerical rating. You've gotten rid of the numerical rating, so you can't have the extreme response style. I think halo error is going to be harder because the 2 statements are balanced in social desirability. So you can't just rate somebody consistently high or consistently low based on your halo. And acquiescence error is also, I think, going to be minimized because, again, the statements are balanced in social desirability. So I don't want to appear to be, saying that we invented forced choice. They go back, more than 50 or 60 years. It's been whoa. Wow. Okay, my monitor just went dead. But looks like the computer's still going. It goes back 50 or 60 years, and David is looking at this format now. So I think it's got some value. So there are some problems with forced choice. Thank you. On whether they're resistant to faking, and then ipsativity. Our experience with faking, with the forced choice, we thought we just balanced statements, the pairs of statements in social desirability, and we were going to be good to go. We had solved the faking good problem. So we did a study where we had one group of people respond honestly. This is for research purposes only. Another group of people, imagine you're applying for a job, you really want to get this job, you have to pass this test to get the job, do your best to pass this test. And we found large fake ability, a very high ability to fake good on the two alternative forced choice format. And so this is where Sasha looked at the items to try to figure out like what went wrong, is that where people were very successful in faking good would be, for example, if you paired a conscientiousness statement with an extroversion statement, and the conscientiousness statement was much higher in conscientiousness than the extroversion statement was in extroversion. So if the extremity parameters of the two statements differ, people could pick the statement that had the higher extremity parameter. And so we did a second study where we constrained the way we created the two alternative pairs to both be balanced in social desirability, but also be balanced in their dimension extremity, in their IRT parameter for extremity, and we found really good resistance to faking. So you need to compare statements that are similar in social desirability and trait extremity to be resistant to faking. So then the other problem with forced choice, traditional forced choice measures, is they're ipsative. And for those of you who don't know what ipsativity is, it's a great word invented by some psychometrician, I suppose. And what it means is that if you had 100 two alternative forced choice items, and you're scoring the test one point for the dimension that you picked, and 0 points for the dimension you didn't pick for each of the two alternative forced choice, everybody's going to end up with 100 points. So your total score is going to be 100. It'll be distributed across, let's say, 5 different dimensions. So you might have 30 on one dimension and 10 on a different dimension, but the sum across all 5 dimensions has to be 100. There's 100 questions, 1 point per question. Okay, so that's what an ipsative measure is. It means the total score sums to a constant. There's some unfortunate statistical issues with ipsativity. One is that the average correlation across the dimensions that are being assessed has to be negative, because on average has to be negative, because a high score on one dimension means you have to have a low score on a different dimension. You can't have high scores on every dimension. And then from the practical point of view, your score on an ipsative measure is a within-person comparison. So that if my conscientiousness is a 30 and my extroversion is a 10, that doesn't mean that I'm conscientious compared to other people. It only means that I'm more conscientious than I'm extroverted. Right? So you can't really make between-person comparisons. So we found we can get around the ipsativity problem by item response theory scoring of two alternative forced choice data. So that's our multi-dimensional pairwise preference model. And Steve Stark developed this model in his dissertation. So we pair items that are similar in desirability but represent different dimensions. And so a typical item is I get along well with others versus I always get my work done in time. And then here's, and so David said, not to make this talk technical. So here's I think probably my only equation. So what this is saying is the probability of picking statement S over statement, saying that statement S is more likely than statement T is equal to the probability of say, so what we're thinking of is like a Thurstone discriminal process situation where you have the two statements and you think, does statement S describe me? Does statement T describe me? And it's a one. It's one if it describes me, zero if it doesn't. And the only way that if I'm thinking statement S, statement T, yeah, they both describe me. I can't make a decision, right? Because both of them describe me. I go back to the discriminal process sample again, and if I say, nah, that doesn't fit me, that doesn't fit me, so I'm more critical this time, I can't make a decision because I get two zeros. The only way that I can make the choice is if I say that this statement describes me, but this statement doesn't. So that's the probability of referring S to T is this probability of getting a 1 on the S dimension and a 0 on the T dimension, divided by the probability of a 1 on the S dimension and a 0 on the T, plus the probability of a 0 on the S and a 1 on the T. And then by local independence, you can factorize it into that equation. And in this equation here, this is where we're using the generalized graded unfolding model. So this is the guts of our model. So putting it all together, we've implemented these thoughts, the two alternative forced choice, ideal point measurement, the multi-dimensional pairwise preference model in the tailored adaptive personality assessment system. And it uses a 22-dimensional model of personality that we developed, and that's a whole story that I guess I don't have time for today. With the two alternative forced choice format, ideal point response theory model with Bayesian trait estimates, and it's a computer adaptive. So it picks items, it forms the pairs adaptively so that they're at the right trait values, so that it's hard for you to decide which one is more like you. So it's almost neat. So the campus assesses, it's a Big Five model, but we're looking at the facets under the Big Five model. You can see, for example, in conscientiousness, industriousness, order, self-control, traditionalism, social responsibility, virtue, and etc. So these are 22 different personality facets. And so now let me turn to does it work? So we've been working on campus and personality really since about 2000. And this our initial study with the Army was around 2007 or 8, and it was successful. And it led the Army to implement campus for pre-enlistment screening in 2009. And since then, in the last 8 years, there have been several versions assessing between 13 to 15 facets, and usually about 120 to alternative forced choice items. The median response time is 22 minutes, so not a lot of time to answer 120 questions. The Army applicants, this has been for some people, the test matters for Army applicants, and sort of that's if your cognitive ability, according to the ARMS AFQT, Armed Forces Qualification Test, is at the 49th percentile or higher. Personality, your cognitive ability is high enough, you're in. For people that have been in the AFQT category 3B, which is like the 32nd to 48th percentile, those people have been screened for, are they motivated for the Army? And so if their campus score comes out in the bottom 10 percentile, they've been not allowed to enlist in the Army. So really, only a very few people are actually screened out. So that's good for research purposes because almost everybody's score is there, so we don't have much of a missing data problem. Air Force applicants for enlistment, we're told that their test scores are for research purposes only. So it's not part of enlistment qualification. So, so the question is, can campus predict attrition? The Army estimates that it costs $100,000 to recruit and train a soldier. So identifying people who are likely to not complete their term of enlistment is a big deal. And attrition runs about 20% over the course of enlistment. So at $100,000 a person, you're talking about a lot of money. And then will-do behaviors are the motivationally driven behaviors. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So first, is there fake resistance for this two alternative format? And this is sort of an eye chart for you. I don't know if you can see it in the back, but comparing scores for the Army and the Air Force applicants. If you look at these standardized difference scores, you can see that they're, I think none of them reach what Cohen would call a small effect. They're all, essentially zero effects. So seems to be resistant to faking. We've also tracked scores over the last 8 years, and we haven't seen any trend for increasing scores over time. So it seems to be resistant to faking, at least among applicants to the Army. Another important consideration in any test development is group differences. We don't want to measure that it's going to adversely impact the enlistment opportunities of women and minorities. And so here are male versus female D values. And what you can see is there are some differences that would be in the small range. The adjustment, men are slightly more adjusted, i.e. less anxious than women, which is a common finding. It's a small effect though, it's not a big effect. But on the other hand, selflessness, women are considerably more selfless than men. And that's actually an interesting dimension. We originally named it generosity. And then the Army leadership was saying, generous soldiers? We don't think about generous soldiers. So we renamed it selflessness. I shall leave no comrade behind. And then they loved it. So, physical conditioning, men like to go to the gym and work out to some degree more than women. Women are more tolerant than the men, applicants to the Army. Overall, and all of this, any decision based on campus is a composite, and so you add several of these things together, and the positive and negatives are going to kind of wash out. So that's male-female. Here are black-white differences, and these are smaller than the male-female differences. And just a couple there, even in the small. The black applicants are higher in orderliness than the white applicants, in higher intolerance. And then nothing else really adds up to very much. So, and we also looked at white, Hispanic, and those were even smaller than the black-white differences. So not a lot of adverse impact in personality. So then really where the rubber hits the road is, do these personality measures predict behavior in the Army? And here's a chart that probably needs some explaining. The x-axis, we've taken composite scores. So this is a will-do composite, and it's predicting are you motivated to be a good soldier? And we've taken scores on this and divided it up into the bottom 20%, the next 20%, all the way to the top 20%. So based on the personality score, we divided the sample up into quintiles. And these are for people who were at the MEPS, the Military Enlistment Processing Station, so applying for enlistment in the Army. And these are results for the Army initial military training. So the outcomes are for that first 12 or 13 weeks in the Army. And what you find here is that this will do, I am motivated to be a good soldier, strongly predicts. The APFT is the Army Physical Fitness Test. Soldiers need to be physically fit, and they are required to take the Army Physical Fitness Test every year. And it's based on doing sit-ups, push-ups, and running 2 miles. So, you know, an overall measure of fitness, you can see a strong relation to the motivated people are scoring better. Disciplinary incidents, again, the Army keeps good track of getting in trouble, and the motivated group are substantially lower in disciplinary incidents than the less motivated. Self-adjustment in the Army has become a big issue. You probably read about the suicides in the Army, and PTSD, etc. And so the Army is concerned about, are the soldiers doing okay? You know, are they psychologically resilient? Are they able to cope with the stress? And what you see here is that the motivated people are reporting that they're doing a lot better being in the Army than the unmotivated group. And then finally, this is attrition. Are they still in the Army after 6 months? And in the low group, there's 12% that are still not in the Army, and versus 7% of the most motivated group. You know, and again, you're thinking each one of these people in this chart who attrits is essentially $100,000 walking out the door. So that was for regular Army, regardless of the MOS, the military occupational specialty. So what we found is that if we can customize the composite for the specific occupation, we can do better. So, you know, it is different being infantry versus being a truck driver or a medic. And so these are probably, I have to admit, probably our best results for infantry occupation in the Army. And you can see here that the attrition for the unmotivated group is 18%. It goes all the way down to 4% for the most motivated group. And, you know, strong results for disciplinary incidents, and for the Army physical fitness. Some positive findings, but not really strong for job knowledge. Our experience is that job knowledge tests are mainly predicted by the ASVAB, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. And after you control for cognitive ability, our personality measure doesn't add much to predictive power. And then these are for recruiters. So these are experienced soldiers, not initial military training. These are people who've been in. This is at least their second term of in the Army. And you can see the same general pattern of greater commitment, better fit with the job, satisfaction with training and their development, and then even performance ratings for the recruiters. So, in sum, you know, I guess my argument is for simple things, the traditional Likert scales are fine. Experiments, you randomly assign people to conditions, it's fine. But once you start to ask more sophisticated questions, model misspecification and cultural differences in response styles is gonna kill you. And so, you know, I think you need to move away from Likert scales and traditional dominance models to more appropriate psychometric models and better response formatting. And so we've been able to predict attrition and motivationally driven aspects of performance. Limitations, our work with primarily with the Army, and so we haven't really done much in the civilian world, and so that's a limitation that our results need to be replicated in the civilian world. And we've worked mostly with personality and a little bit with vocational interest, but there's, you know, many self-report constructs out there that I think, you know, I think just in general, self-report constructs need ideal point models rather than dominance models. So, thank you for a couple of questions. Questions? Yes.
Well, it seems that your methodology, in a way, depends on that you're assessing multiple dimensions. So how does it work when you've got a real single unidimensional part? Yeah. Should I try it again? Can you hear?
No.
We were that before.
So it seems to me that your method depends a bit on equating across dimensions. So if you have a purely unidimensional construct, how do you equate and get any useful information out?
Yeah, so we've done a little bit of work with unidimensional, just forming two alternative force choice with unidimensional comparisons. And we use it, we use a different psychometric model, the Zinnes-Griggs model, for the psychometric model, which is, again, it's an ideal point model, but it's different than the generalized graded unfolding model. So we use a different model, and you know, and honestly, I would be a lot more concerned about people being able to fake good on a unidimensional comparison, because on almost any dimension where there's any degree of evaluativeness, high versus low, people can make that differentiation. You know, maybe for something like aesthetics, like I like to go to museums. I don't like to go to museums. You know, I can see young people seeing that as more of a neutral dimension. But you know, anything like industriousness, orderliness, extroversion, conscience, you know, all of that, I would be concerned about faking good.
Yeah.
Thanks. Really interesting talk. I guess I'm struck by the criterion validity, and it's a fairly simple question. I have like 12. I'd love to ask, but I won't. So I'm just curious about how you form those composites. Were those sort of a regression analysis of the best fitting? And so, what do your effect sizes look like when you? Is that the validation sample that you've developed them on one sample and now you've evaluated them in a second sample, or is this your kind of original data? To what extent are those sort of overfitting?
Yeah. So for the continuous outcome variables, we do just regular multiple regression and get the multiple correlations, and then we get the adjusted R's. And our sample sizes, you know, when you have 4,000 people, the shrinkage is really tiny. I don't know how to do an adjusted R-square for logistic regression. So we have an Nagelkirke, if that's the right way to pronounce it, R for the logistic regression. But I don't know, I've never seen an adjustment for that kind of an R.
I'll leave my other questions.
Okay. So, did you have Likert type competitors to show the incremental validity of yours over the stuff that you said is just worthless?
We know. So the short answer is no. But the longer answer is Len White at the Army Research Institute and his colleagues at ARI have been doing this kind of research dating back to the 1960s. And they've had a couple examples where they develop a single statement Likert scales in research samples that work fine, that work as well, you know, as well as the stuff that we have. When they've gone operational with the measures, the validity just goes to zero. The average scores go up by a standard deviation or 2 standard deviations, and the correlation with criterion measures goes to close to zero. So the Army sort of feels that they've been there, done that, and they were not interested in having us replicate that work.
So you have these huge Army samples. If someone was to try to organize in smaller samples, how large the sample? What's the minimum sample size that you need to make this these things converge, the Bayesian estimation, and to make this practical?
So for estimating the item parameters for the GW model, probably you'd want at least 400 or 500.
That's not bad.
It's so I was talking with Rich Roberts, who's one of Pat Killinan's pals, a former ETS employee, and he's been using Anna Brown's model for two alternative force choice. And he says that, he told me that for them to get good results with that model, that they need a couple thousand. But that's, if you remember, if you've seen her paper, her model's really complicated. You know, lots of constraints, and for everything to converge, she needs big samples. For the generalized graded unfolding model, actually, I'll talk tomorrow about our trials and tribulations with estimation there. And there are problems with it, but in IRT, you can have pretty large item parameter estimation errors and still get good trade estimates.
This is a good point to remind everyone who's on we at Rossville campus that Fritz will talk again tomorrow at 11:30 about improving measurement in personality. And so, opportunity once again to thank you very much, and please enjoy the food. Thank you.